In the spring of 1565, the Mediterranean belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Its fleets dominated the sea. Its armies had conquered kingdoms, broken fortresses, and humbled some of the greatest powers of Europe. From the gates of Vienna to the shores of North Africa, Ottoman influence stretched across continents. To many observers, the empire appeared unstoppable, and when news spread that Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had ordered an invasion of the tiny island of Malta, most people assumed the outcome was already decided. Malta was small, isolated, poor in resources, surrounded by one of the most powerful naval forces on earth. Against the empire stood only a few thousand defenders, Knights of St. John, local Maltese militia, mercenaries, sailors, and civilians. Their total strength was tiny compared to the force gathering against them. Yet Malta possessed something the Ottomans underestimated: determination. For decades, the Knights had fought Ottoman expansion across the Mediterranean. Driven from Rhodes in 1522, they had rebuilt themselves on Malta, turning the island into a heavily fortified military outpost. They knew they were a target. They knew one day the empire would come for them, and in 1565, that day arrived. As spring turned toward summer, one of the largest invasion fleets ever assembled in the Mediterranean appeared on the horizon. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, elite Janissaries, veteran commanders, artillery powerful enough to reduce stone walls to dust. To many watching from the island's fortresses, the sight seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The sea itself appeared covered in sails. Yet inside Malta's defences, panic never fully took hold. The defenders understood something critical. There would be no retreat, no evacuation, no rescue in time. If Malta fell, they would likely die, and if they survived, their world would disappear forever. So while Ottoman commanders prepared for what they believed would be a short campaign, Malta prepared for a siege that would become one of the most famous last stands in military history. Both sides believed victory was possible. Only one side believed survival depended on it. When the Ottoman fleet finally anchored off the coast of Malta in May 1565, few commanders doubted how the campaign would unfold. The plan seemed simple: capture the small forward fortress guarding the harbour, open the way for the fleet, establish artillery dominance, then systematically destroy the island's remaining defences. The target was Fort St. Elmo. On paper, it looked vulnerable. The fort was relatively small. Its garrison was limited. Its position exposed it to attacks from both land and sea. Ottoman commanders believed it would fall within days. Some estimates suggested less than a week. Instead, it became a nightmare. From the moment Ottoman artillery opened fire, Fort St. Elmo absorbed punishment that would have broken many larger fortifications. Cannonballs smashed into stone walls day and night. Entire sections of defences collapsed. Dust filled the air so constantly that survivors later described breathing through clouds of powdered rock. Yet every morning, Ottoman observers saw something astonishing. The walls were still occupied. The defenders were still there, and their banners still flew. Inside the fort, life became a cycle of destruction and repair. During daylight, artillery tore apart defences. At night, exhausted knights, soldiers, sailors, and civilians rebuilt what they could using rubble, timber, and determination. Many knew they would not survive. They worked anyway. The commanders of the knights understood something critical. Every extra day Fort St. Elmo remained standing bought precious time for the rest of Malta. So the defenders transformed the fort into a machine designed to trade lives for time. And it worked. Ottoman frustration grew rapidly. Elite troops were committed. Additional artillery arrived. Naval bombardments intensified. Still the fort resisted. Among the attackers were some of the finest soldiers in the empire, including elite Janissaries who had helped conquer cities across 3 continents. They expected resistance. They did not expect obsession. Because the defenders of St. Elmo fought as though surrender no longer existed. Reports from the siege describe hand-to-hand combat among shattered walls, desperate counterattacks, and wounded men returning to battle because there were too few healthy defenders left. By June, casualties on both sides were mounting. But the real shock came when Ottoman commanders realized how much time they had already lost. What was supposed to be a brief opening operation had become a costly struggle draining manpower, morale, and momentum. And then something happened that stunned both armies. The defenders kept fighting. Even after it became obvious the fort could not be saved. Most military logic suggested evacuation, retreat, preservation of remaining forces. Instead, the garrison stayed, because by now the battle was no longer about victory. It was about denying victory to the enemy. And in that mission, Fort St. Elmo was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. After weeks of relentless bombardment, bloodshed, and sacrifice, Fort St. Elmo finally fell. For the Ottoman commanders, it should have been a moment of triumph. The objective had been achieved. The fort was destroyed. Its defenders were nearly annihilated. The entrance to the harbor was now open. And yet, the victory felt strangely expensive. Because by the time the Ottoman banners rose above the shattered ruins of St. Elmo, something had become impossible to ignore. The siege was already taking far longer than expected. Thousands of experienced soldiers had been lost. Elite units that were supposed to spearhead later operations had been consumed in the struggle. Valuable weeks had disappeared beneath rubble, cannon smoke, and failed assaults. Most importantly, the defenders of Malta had gained exactly what they needed: time. Inside the remaining strongholds of Malta, the news of St. Elmo's fall was received with grief, but not despair, because everyone understood what the fort had accomplished. Its defenders had not died to save a building. They had died to save an island. And now the burden passed to the larger fortifications of Burgu and Sanglier. Unlike St. Elmo, these positions were better prepared, more heavily defended, and supported by the surviving core of the Knights of St. John. At the center of that defense stood an aging leader whose determination would become legendary: Jean Parasot de Valette. By 1565, de Valette was already in his 70s. Most men his age sought peace, comfort, or retirement. Instead, he walked the walls daily. He inspected artillery. He spoke directly with wounded defenders. He supervised repairs. And perhaps most importantly, he refused to discuss surrender. His message was simple: if Malta fell, they would die. If Malta survived, Europe might survive with it. Meanwhile, Ottoman commanders prepared for the decisive phase of the campaign. Massive artillery batteries targeted the remaining defenses. Assault ladders were assembled. New attacks were planned. There was still confidence. But it was no longer effortless confidence. Because every day the siege continued raised a dangerous question. What if Malta refused to break? The answer began appearing during the next assaults. Repeated attacks against Burgu and Sanglier encountered resistance unlike anything Ottoman commanders expected. Defenders fought from shattered walls, rooftops, churches, streets, and improvised barricades. Civilians joined military operations. Priests carried ammunition. Women transported supplies and treated wounded soldiers. The island itself seemed to be fighting, and that made Malta extraordinarily dangerous. Because fortresses can be destroyed, an entire population determined to resist is much harder to defeat. As summer intensified and casualties mounted, a campaign that was supposed to demonstrate Ottoman dominance began turning into something else entirely, a test of endurance. And for the first time since the invasion began, the empire was beginning to lose it. By August 1565, the siege had entered a stage neither side had originally expected. The Ottoman Empire had planned a swift campaign. The defenders of Malta had expected to die quickly. Instead, both sides found themselves trapped in a brutal struggle of endurance. The summer heat became its own enemy. Water grew scarce. Disease spread through crowded camps. Corpses accumulated faster than they could be buried. The smell of smoke, blood, gunpowder, and death settled permanently over parts of the island. Yet despite everything, the defenders still refused to surrender. For the Ottoman commanders, this was becoming increasingly frustrating. Every major assault achieved local successes but failed to produce final victory. Walls could be damaged. Towers could be shattered. Entire neighborhoods could be reduced to ruins. But the defenders simply continued fighting. Again, and again, and again. The assault on Sanglier became one of the most dramatic moments of the siege. Ottoman forces launched coordinated attacks from land and sea, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer pressure. The plan nearly worked. Nearly. At several points, Ottoman troops came dangerously close to breaking through. Fighting erupted on defensive walls, in narrow streets, and around artillery positions. For a moment, it seemed the defenders might finally collapse beneath the weight of constant attacks. But something remarkable happened. The defenders held. Not because they were stronger, not because they had more soldiers, but because they had nowhere left to retreat. And armies with no retreat often become extraordinarily difficult to defeat. Meanwhile, Grand Master Jean Peresot de Valette remained everywhere. He appeared at artillery positions, at hospitals, at damaged walls, at defensive meetings. Survivors later described him as calm even during the worst moments of the siege. That calm mattered, because morale had become as important as ammunition. Every day Malta remained unconquered, damaged Ottoman confidence and strengthened defender resolve. Then came the rumor. At first, almost nobody believed it. A relief force. Coming from Sicily. 4 months, the defenders had hoped for outside assistance. 4 months, little had arrived. Many had already accepted that they would fight alone. But now reports began spreading through the island. Ships had been sighted. European forces were moving. Help was finally coming. The news electrified the defenders. At the same time, it alarmed Ottoman commanders, because they understood a simple reality. If fresh troops arrived while their own army was exhausted, wounded, and stretched thin, the entire campaign could unravel. And suddenly, after months of confidence, it was the Ottoman side that felt pressure. The siege had become a race. Could Malta be crushed before relief arrived? Or had the defenders already survived long enough? In September 1565, after nearly 4 months of relentless warfare, something happened that few people in Europe had believed possible. The Ottoman Empire began preparing to leave. Not because its soldiers lacked courage, not because its commanders lacked experience, but because Malta had survived. The relief force from Sicily was not enormous by the standards of great empires. Yet it arrived at exactly the right moment. Fresh troops entered a battlefield where Ottoman forces were already exhausted by months of combat, disease, heat, casualties, and frustration. The balance shifted. Suddenly, the invaders were no longer fighting an isolated island. They were fighting time itself. The arrival of reinforcements boosted morale across Malta. Defenders who had spent months living among ruins now realized they might actually survive. The possibility of victory, which had seemed absurd at the beginning of the siege, became real. For Ottoman commanders, the situation looked very different. Every additional day increased risk. Every delay threatened disaster. Every casualty became harder to replace. The campaign that was supposed to demonstrate imperial power was now consuming enormous resources with no guarantee of success. Eventually, the decision was made. Withdraw. For many soldiers on both sides, the moment felt unreal. The same empire that had terrified Europe for generations was leaving Malta unconquered. As Ottoman ships prepared to depart, the defenders looked across battlefields covered in ruins, broken artillery, collapsed walls, and thousands of graves. The cost of survival had been staggering. Entire sections of Malta lay devastated. Communities had been shattered. Families had been destroyed. Yet the island remained free, and that mattered far beyond Malta itself. Across Europe, news of the siege spread rapidly. Kings, nobles, merchants, priests, and ordinary citizens celebrated the outcome. The victory became a symbol that the Ottoman Empire, though immensely powerful, was not invincible. That psychological impact may have been even more important than the military result, because before Malta, many believed resistance was ultimately hopeless. After Malta, people began believing something else, that determined defenders could survive against overwhelming odds. The legacy of the siege continued for centuries. New fortifications were built. A new city, Valette, would rise in honor of Grand Master de Valette. Military historians would study the campaign as one of the greatest defensive operations in history. And even today, the Great Siege remains remarkable not because the defenders were stronger, but because they refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. Fort St. Elmo fell. The walls shattered. Thousands died. Yet somehow, Malta endured. And in doing so, a small island changed the course of Mediterranean history.